Welcome to the Hourly Podcast, where we dive deep into the stories of leaders who are shaping the future of work and organizational culture. I'm your host, AJ Rikiki, and in today's episode, we dive deep into the story of Heather Morgan, Chief of Staff and Strategy at Alamo Drafthouse Cinema. I enjoyed today's conversation as she brought us through her background in a 100-person town and how that led to a life of industrial and organizational psychology, staffing, and helping others grow. I've known Heather now for years, and I'm always inspired by the different policies and passion she injects into her work. So tune in as we unpack the various things that she's done in her career to make the hourly workforce better. Well, again, thank you so much, Heather, for hopping on the Hourly Podcast. For those of you that don't know me, my name is AJ Rikiki. I'm sitting here with somebody that I've gotten to know for, 2-3 years now with your role at Alamo. And so excited to dig into everything that you do, the different things you accomplish at the business, and learn more about your history, how you ended up in this place, because it's a little bit different than what I say most of our HR leaders have come from. So really excited to dig in that today. Thanks so much for being on.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah. So bring us to the beginning. So, I don't know if you grew up in Kansas, but I know you went to college there and you did a lot of research, sciencey things. And then somehow now you're the Chief of Staff and Strategy at one of the largest groups of theaters and cinema. So take us back to those early days. Why Kansas, and what got you into people?
Okay. So once upon a time, I lived in a tiny town in Kansas. The town that I grew up in is called Soldier, Kansas, and the population was about 100 people when I grew up there and now. So when I say small town, it's like the smallest of small towns.
Got it.
And when you grow up in a town that small, there are certain things that it imbues you with. And one of them is this innate sense of caring for the people around you. You have a responsibility to look out for the person to your left and to your right. No one is out for themselves. Everyone is part of the larger community because it's still a very small group. And so I think what that instilled in me was just this lifelong desire to have a role where I could help take care of people. And so I went to college at Washburn University with a goal to be a clinical psychologist. I wanted to be a therapist. And then as I was going through, I was also really loving my business classes. And my advisor said, well, if you're loving psychology and you're also loving business, you could combine those two and get a degree in industrial organizational psychology. And you could be an organizational consultant. You can work in things like employee motivation, employee training, organizational climate and culture, leadership development, all these things that you're interested in. You could combine these roles. So I thought that seemed like a brilliant idea. So I got my master's and then my PhD in industrial organizational psychology. And I was an organizational consultant for a while for Service Management Group. And I had a number of different clients in restaurant, retail, and entertainment spaces. One of those ended up being AMC Theaters, who recruited me to come work for them exclusively. I did that for 7 years. And then Harkins Theaters, who are based in Scottsdale, Arizona, recruited me to work for them. I did that for 4 years. And then 2 years ago, Alamo Drafthouse recruited me to come over as their Chief of Staff and Strategy. And this, out of all the roles that I've had, so I've accidentally carved out a career in theatrical exhibition without ever having gone to film school or necessarily being a cinephile.
Right.
But in all of those roles, I've gotten to focus on the teams that worked for me and worked with me. And now in this role as Chief of Staff, I get to extend that to the broader organization as a whole, which is probably the best fit of any role that I think I've ever had so far.
No, I love it. And I have a soft spot for data and psychology and the sciences behind human resources. But, what's so interesting about human resources and science is that sometimes that's not symbiotic, right? They're paradoxical in a way that you would apply science and data and math to human resources that I think a lot of people from the outside say is a very soft profession in the sense that it's people oriented. So it's imperfect and all these different things. So I don't think we've ever had a PhD IO Psych here on the show. Maybe take a step back and bring us through, what is that and what sort of things that you study that equip you for that human resource piece?
Well, so it's interesting. it's a broad arena. Like I said,
Right.
you can really pick your specialty. Some people who get degrees in IO psychology want to focus solely on scale creation and validation of scales. So scales
Right.
that are going to measure job satisfaction and employee engagement and all of these, critical criteria that inform a lot of decisions that are made in the workforce. They want to focus on, the scales that do that, or they want to focus on, negotiation tactics or conflict resolution or whatever. Rather than going into that specifically, I'm more of a generalist, and that hasn't been by choice. It's just been by happenstance. So because I accidentally followed the opportunities that were presented in front of me, rather than guiding my career like it were rather than navigating it as though it were a guided missile, I just followed the opportunities as they came. And so really what that equips me with is the things that I leverage most are leadership development. So I think often when leaders advance through levels within an organization, they get less and less coaching and they get less and less feedback. And part of that is just because you reach a certain level and people assume that you must already have these prerequisite skills to be an effective leader, or they're afraid to give them to you because the position title that you hold is somewhat intimidating and they don't feel like it's appropriate. So leadership development is something that really, I think, lacks at the highest levels of many organizations. And so that is something that we focus on. And organizational climate and culture. As you're trying to change any organization, I've been in theatrical exhibition through the COVID period. Now, COVID affected a number of different industries. Yes, exactly. So if you were ever going to need to take a really hard look at your organizational climate and culture and what your workforce is wanting from its employers, it was post-COVID. It was when we couldn't find enough people. It was during the Great Resignation. It was during quiet quitting and working remotely. And all of those things, still persist today. So leadership development and employee motivation and organizational climate and culture is a big piece of what I focus on.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? So, my day job being the CEO of Sprockets is we deal with now millions of hires every single year. And I remember last year, because I'm still finishing up my degree up in Boston at nights and weekends when I have time, I've been taking IO psychology classes. And what's so interesting, like to your point, is like understanding kind of like the unit foundations for everything from leadership to career development to feedback to hiring. I think like in human resources, that's such a wrap of being, again, like the soft stuff, right? Of like, oh, you should have this conversation with them and you should navigate it like that. And I think on the surface, there's not that much, at least I thought, science that went into it. But when you look at it forensically from a scientific point of view, and I've taken some of these classes even in the last 2 years, you really start to see, and once you understand the foundation, how you can pull on certain levers. And I don't want to say leverage because it kind of sounds like a dirty word, but leverage human behavior and human psychology to optimize the workforce and like speak the love language of your workers to be able to help them achieve what they need, rather than just buying pizza on a Friday and hoping that they are happy, right?
Yeah, I think it's a real pain point for those of us who have a degree and a career in the quote unquote soft sciences. I think it being called a soft science is always a sticking point and a source of contention, because there is so much about human behavior and human motivation and human output that is measurable and predictable and quantifiable. And you can put these things in a regression and you can have predictability. And so what motivates us as people, I think a lot of times I've seen leaders and organizations treat it almost like it's guesswork. It's like, I don't know what these people want. We'll try to do our best and we'll throw a bunch of things at it, maybe, and throw in pizza too. But if you measure these things and ask people, you can scientifically establish what it is that motivates your workforce and what they need and what they want and what gets the best results.
And I think that's part of the reason why I'm just so passionate about like the hourly workforce. And I'm sure you feel this way too, is, in locations, whether it's a restaurant, a cinema, a hotel, a gas station, whatever, all across the country, we're asking people who aren't not qualified, but not interested, not passionate about hiring and managing hourly workers to do so without all of that formal training, right? So it's like, think about all the time and effort that you put into that science and the time and effort I have as well. and I think we have a special appreciation for it, and we act accordingly, try to provide tools to be able to help people also kind of see the importance of all these different things. But practically in the field, the people who are doing the hiring and managing the hourly workers at scale, like a sub shop in Fayetteville, Arkansas, is somebody who just got off the line themselves or just got out of the hourly workforce. And now they're being asked to do all these things without all these formal trainings and without these doctorate programs. So I know you're really passionate about kind of applying and scaling your awesome people practices to the many locations you guys have. You guys have 50. Is that correct? 50 locations?
We have 40 locations across the country.
40 locations. Like, how, from your perspective, how can someone scale that to the ground floor? How can we get it into the locations and make sure all the things that you know how to do right are being done to that ground level, not just staying up in the white collar workforce and people that you might be able to touch, in the boardroom?
So, got it. It's a good question that you ask. And it can be difficult to improve consistency and maintain consistency across an organization of any substantial size. And it is a difficult chore to ask people of varying levels of experience and background to, be effective in their hiring, especially when they haven't been trained. So how we do that, or I think some of the best ways to do that, are to ensure that you're constantly training your leaders in the venues. Each venue has its own individual culture. And that's why the teammate experience across different venues can vary so widely. And we do have a fair amount of turnover in our industry, just like in any sort of food service or movie exhibition company. And so as you have leaders cycle out and bring new leaders on board, you need to retrain them. And that means training them on things like what it is that makes a good teammate. What types of people and what types of interests are going to thrive in different positions that we have across our different venues. So helping guide teammates in terms of what they should be applying for, setting expectations, setting the right impression from the very beginning. If a teammate, they're interviewing us as much as we're interviewing them. So when they come in to interview with Alamo, if their first impressions of the manager are disappointing, or they feel like that person doesn't have time for them or isn't interested in having them on the team, it starts the whole thing off on a negative path, which we want to avoid. And then you also need to educate things like unconscious bias. So we know people who have studied psychology, they know the role that unconscious bias plays in how we interact with our environment and the people within our environment, and how we approach everything from daily interactions with strangers on the street to things like interviews. So training people about what those unconscious biases are and how to avoid them and manage them is critical. And then also equipping them with the right tools. It's difficult to give a leader with a varying level of experience a blank sheet of paper and tell them to go interview someone and leave it to them to know what to ask and, what to say. And so you really have to guide them with the right tools, I think, to help, improve consistency across different venues.
Yeah. And there's just so much to sink your teeth in there, right? You got from unconscious bias to hiring guides to training new managers. So much that we can talk about, and we will. But let's start with just, if somebody hasn't heard of Alamo before, how many people do you typically hire per year, per location? What type of roles are you looking for? What's that person typically like? And just orient the office or the listener so that when people are hearing these different strategies, it can either apply to them or not apply to them.
Sure, absolutely. So for those of you who are not familiar with Alamo Drafthouse, we are a dine-in cinema chain. So I was telling AJ, we have 40 locations across the country. 20 of them are company owned and 20 of them are franchise owned. Our franchisees do their own hiring. They have their own processes and procedures. They manage their own shops completely independently. But for our company owned locations, we employ more people than your average cinema because we're a dine-in. So think of it like a restaurant. You go sit in one of our seats and there's a full menu and a server will come. We call them guest attendants, but a guest attendant will come. They'll take your order. They'll put it in. The kitchen will make your food. And then a person we call them guest attendants as well, but basically it's a running function where they bring your food from the kitchen to the auditorium. They deliver it in your seat. So on average, I would say at our slowest or smallest locations, we employ probably 60 people per venue. And at our busiest locations, we employ maybe 140 to 150 people per venue. And they range. So we have a handful of managers at each venue. A large portion of our staff is made up of, like I said, guest attendants, and they're the people who take the orders from guests in the auditorium and bring the food. We have someone working concierge. We have people who work concierge, which is the desk in the front where you can buy your tickets and get assistance. We have bars in all of our theaters. We're Alamo Drafthouse, so beer and alcohol and that adult dining experience is very important to us. So we have specialty bars in all of our venues. So we have bartenders, and then we have back of house kitchen teammates. So we have people who make the food that we serve, and those are the primary positions that we have.
Yeah. So one of the things that strikes me about this is it's a lot of diversity in the roles, right? Different skill sets, different interests, different levels of expertise and experience. How do you have one singular recruiting process for all of those, right? How do you navigate the challenges, especially in today's labor shortage, of being able to bring in people and make sure that they're in the right seat, given all the diversity?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that we do is with the job descriptions. We try to be really clear about what the job is going to entail, because what we have found, our workforce is they're very savvy. They're very intelligent. They know what they're looking for. They know what they'll like and what they don't like. And they tend to look through, because of the way recruiting is today, they can look through so many job postings in such a short period of time that we find that the people that we interview are pretty well honed in terms of what they weed in and weed out. So they usually know the types of jobs that they're looking for, and they'll go for those. So clear job descriptions, I think, in your postings is really critical so that people know what to expect and they don't waste their time. If you're unclear, then you're going to get people who maybe aren't interested once they find out what the role actually is, or that they aren't a good fit once they get in there and they interview. In the instances where we do have someone who applies and they may not be qualified or not a good fit for what they did apply for, but we think that they might be well qualified for something else, then that's a conversation we can have during the interview process. If they want a role that's more senior level, but they don't have the background experience to qualify for them at the onset, then we talk to them about career pathing. So you can start at Alamo in this role, and then as you work your way up, you can become this, and then this, and then this. And so you paint a picture for them of, if they want to stay and grow with Alamo, what that career looks like. And we try to make it very clear what the benefits are that we have along the way. Because another thing that we know about our teammates is when they're evaluating us, I mentioned it being a dual interview. We're interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing us. So when they are interviewing us, they're interested in much more than just the pay and the hours and what the job actually is. They're also interested in, what is our overall benefits package? What is the work-life balance going to be like? What is the culture on the team? Are they going to enjoy working with the people around them? Are they going to enjoy the atmosphere when they're working in the venue? So we try to we try to paint that picture pretty clearly. And if they stay with us for 90 days, then they're in for a while. Usually if they start and it turns out that they just aren't happy or it's not what they thought it was going to be, they'll opt to turn over within the first 30 to 60 days.
Yeah. And as you're having those conversations, because I love the intimacy there, right? You bring people in, and it's the best way to get feedback on your hiring process as well, as talking to the applicants and then making micro adjustments as you kind of see things change in the labor market and culture and all these different things, right? And part of the reason why bringing people in for conversations and for interviews is so important, other than I just need to make sure that they're real. And if they are real, make them an offer, which a lot of businesses kind of get caught in the trap of doing. So talk to me a little bit, after getting feedback from a lot of those conversations, like, what is sticking with hourly workers? Like, when you give them, hey, we have these perks, this pay, this culture, this fun, what do you think is really grabbing people towards your org?
So our org is unique. I mean, every org is unique, but the Alamo, I would say first and foremost, it's the Alamo culture. So again, if you don't know Alamo Drafthouse, it's hard to understand, or it's hard to articulate what the Alamo culture is, but it's almost like a counterculture. So the types of teammates that we tend to attract and the types of guests that we tend to attract, and those two pools of people overlap. We find that a lot of our teammates applied because they loved being guests and they loved to come and watch. So they already are intimately familiar with what the roles are because they've been coming from the guest perspective. So then they apply and they want to work for us. But regardless of which route they came to us, the Alamo culture, it's sort of seen, I think, as a beacon and a beacon of acceptance and a safe space for people who have sometimes never felt like they really fit in anywhere else. I've had a number of teammates tell me things like, I had a really hard time in high school, and I really don't think I would have made it had it not been for Alamo. This was where I would come all the time and find people like me, where I didn't feel all of a sudden like I was alone and ostracized like I did with all my peers at school. I saw people here who looked like me, talked like me. This felt like I belonged here. So a lot of what our teammates, I think, are looking for when they apply to join us is a sense of belonging. And so that culture is really, really important. And we try to protect it very carefully. So the culture is, I'd say, the number one driver. But in terms of the logistics, so yes, they are looking for very competitive pay. They want to be, they want to be paid as high as the market says is reasonable for the roles that they are doing. But they also want things like, we heard from our teammates, expanded mental health services. That was a big deal. Life is difficult right now, and the economy is challenging, and it gets a little overwhelming, I think, for a lot of people. And so our teammates said, we really want more access to mental health services, and we need them to be affordable. And so we recently partnered with a company to expand our mental health services. So our teammates have unlimited access to free mental health calls with this company. It's not meant to be long-term ongoing care, but it's meant to be sort of short-term isolated incidents that they might be having, where they can call and talk to a therapist online and get assistance. So that has been a huge deal for them. Another thing is our insurance. So our teammates are used to working for companies where you have to work for an extended period of time or work a certain number of hours before you qualify. And for a lot of our teammates, that wasn't feasible. They started and they said, I need to have health insurance right away. So we changed our program, where now our health insurance coverage starts the first of the month after you've been hired. So if you're hired on the 20th of May, then you're eligible for benefits starting on June 1st, no matter how many hours you work. So if you work for us 1 hour a week, if you are an employee of Alamo Drafthouse, then you can qualify for part-time benefits. And then if you reach full-time hours, you're eligible for full-time coverage. But just having immediate access to healthcare benefits in some magnitude that didn't require them to have already worked a certain number of hours was huge. And then lastly, I would also say the 401k matching has been a big deal. We didn't used to do 401k matching for our hourly teammates, and that is something that we do now. And a lot of the teammates that we hire, they're early on in their careers and they don't know, they're not thinking necessarily about saving for retirement. They've never had a 401k before. They don't know much about it. And so I've been on a bit of a road show across our venues talking to teammates about, this is what a 401k plan is. This is what the matching part means. This is how you can think about it. And every time I talk about it, I end up with many of the teammates coming up to me afterwards, wanting to know how they can enroll, telling me they're interested. And so that's resonated very well too.
No, I love that. And, it really strikes a chord with me, the mental health resources, right? With COVID that happened, and the hourly workers facing record high credit card debt, facing record high student loan debt. I would assume that many of the people who work for you also went to art school, which isn't cheap, as you know, and the pressures and everything of the hourly workforce can be a huge burden. So kudos to your team and you for identifying that and providing it. I think it's really cool. But one thing that you talked about that's just so interesting to me, because culture clearly priority number one for Alamo, right? And since I've known you, you've been preaching that to me, and I look up to the Alamo culture because I know how accepting it is, and I know that what impact that can have on the hourly worker is something that I respect profoundly. And I think of building culture being very challenging for the franchise model, because at some time, from location to location, but also operator to operator, there's a culture that's Alamo, which is all 40 locations, and then there's micro cultures within each location. Any thoughts around that? How do you drive your culture in when you let things go? And I know that's an impossible question to ask, but just for the sake of the podcast, how do you think of all that?
It's a good question, especially given the franchise component. I will say, so that Alamo culture, the tenets of it. So we have our core values. We have foster community, boldly go, do the right thing, and give a shit. Those are our 4 core values, and we live and breathe by those. And those are something that are necessary for every venue all of them, no matter where you're located or who your owner is. And then but I will say that not the strength of the culture, but the exact nuance of the culture, it does vary, I think, based on where you are. When we started in Austin. So all of our Austin venues have this very strong Alamo culture. But, one of our most successful franchise locations is in Springfield, Missouri. We just opened up our first location in Naples, Florida. And that sometimes gets eyebrows. Like, I wouldn't have expected Alamo to go into Naples. That doesn't seem like an Alamo kind of place. We hear that a lot. That doesn't seem like an Alamo kind of place. Right. And I think, and I understand where that sentiment comes from, but I think one thing that we've learned is that this desire for a sense of belonging, it exists everywhere. Every teammate that we have has the desire for a sense of belonging. And so they don't all look the same. They don't all think the same. They don't all identify the same. But if they feel like they can come in and just be their authentic selves and be accepted and not be judged, and they work for a company that wants to help them develop and grow and thrive, I feel like that resonates with them. And then our culture is it's so driven by what we do internally, but it's also driven heavily by our external marketing messaging, because it also influences the guests that come in. So when I say it really is a culture that is inherent in our teammates and our guests, we have a brand voice that is very strong and it resonates with our guests, and people either identify with it and they like it, or they don't. And if they don't, they probably opt out of going to Alamo. And if they like it, they opt in. And so even that external messaging that you're sending to guests and those guests that come into the building, they help shape a company culture too, and how they interact with our teammates. And so we give every venue the flexibility to kind of drive its own culture, as long as it adheres to, our core tenets. Kindness is the cost of entry for us. You have to be kind. You have to be willing to show up, presuming positive intent. You have to want to do your best. You have to care about what we do, care about guests. If you love film, that's a huge bonus, because, a lot of us really passionately love film, and that's what we're going to want to talk to you about and how we'll want to find common ground. But really just, if you're looking to be part of something that is different and unique and enjoyable, then usually you'll find a way to get very comfortable with us.
No, I love the way you talk about it, right? It's just so romantic to you and the Alamo brand. And I get that too, right? Of culture can drive the company, and culture is just kind of like that thing that's hard to describe. But I had somebody on the podcast articulate it really well. They said, culture is the worst behavior that you will tolerate, right?
Yes.
Because if you tolerate something, or you turn a blind eye to any type of behavior, right? Then that says something and signals something to the rest of the team, right? And that same person encouraged me to think about how you talk about culture and how you continue to drive it to the org. And that changes based on how big your organization is and how new your organization is. So if you're a brand new company, you're trying to establish culture, it is a little bit of, you kind of have to drive it down. You have to pound your chest as a company, and you have to say, these are our core values. These are all these things, right? A more established company, culture is just how everyone interacts, right? It's what people say to each other at the water cooler. It's how you treat your customers, and it's just kind of like fluid without the organization. When you think about culture and kind of where you guys are in terms of its life cycle, is it something that you still I don't want to say enforce, because that doesn't feel like the right word, but is it something that you talk about often? Is it something that you guys take a lot of pride in and share with others? Or have you gotten to the point where it's just Alamo now? Where are you on that spectrum?
That's a good question. And I would say if you had asked me that pre-COVID, I think my answer would have been different. But post-COVID, I would say that we, like any relationship, the relationships that you have within an organization, they go through peaks and valleys, and they ebb and flow, and the external factors influence them. And I would say that post-COVID, we had so much turnover. because we were closed for, many months. And then we got people back who had been waiting to come back and had been with Alamo a long time. But we hired this massive influx of new people at the support center, new leaders in the venue, new hourly teammates in the venue. And so you almost had this, I wouldn't say that it was a clash, but you had this sort of old guard, the people who knew Alamo, knew the culture, loved Alamo, loved the culture. And then you had this whole massive batch of new people who needed to learn what Alamo is and who it is, and figuring out how to blend these two groups of people. Because sometimes, the OGs can get a little concerned that the new people are going to try to change things. And they, again, they feel like the company belongs to them too. It's a dearly beloved thing. They feel ownership over the company and over its culture and over its messaging. And so I would say that we really have had to do a whole new wave of not only re-emphasizing and retraining our culture to everyone, but also putting a huge emphasis on change management. Because post-COVID, and even as we go into the future, our company has changed greatly and is always changing. We have, a new CEO. We had a new CEO before that. We, again, a lot of new people post-COVID, and we've opened new venues. And so as we continue to grow and we have new leadership, it's important, I think, to keep doubling down and re-emphasizing to people what your culture is, not only so that all the new people that come on board know it and understand it and appreciate it, but also so the people who have been with you a long time understand that you still know the culture and that you're still reinforcing what they hold so dear. If you don't talk about it, then that fear can build in their minds, and then they don't know where the company's headed because you're not telling them that this is what is staying the same and this is changing. So I think what I have learned, not just through my career, but also in particular at my time at Alamo, is that over communicating is critical. You can't say certain things enough times.
Yeah. And communicating culture is just so important, especially in the hourly workforce, just because of the high degree of turnover, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like a white collar workforce that maybe you have 10% turnover in every given year. You're talking, average, let's just say restaurants 150%, which means of the people who start January 1, you're going to probably have to replace them twice, right? By January 1, the following year. And so in these short stints, it's hard. And to your point, you really know kind of in the first 30 to 60 days to drive that culture, get people excited about it, and kind of have that great first week. So when you think about that in the context of Alamo, is there anything special you do? Because you do have that amazing culture early on to get people excited? Or is it just you join and you feel it right away?
Well, I think we take great strides to train people in what Alamo is. So we have sort of we have a brand DNA book. Like, this is who we are. This is who Alamo is. These were our guiding principles when we were founded. This is how we do things. This is how what we do is different than what others do. These are our core values, and some examples of how you can see those having been actually played out in real life over the course of our history. So I think just that education about, or just a really strong introduction to the culture in the beginning. I think a lot of companies, they don't necessarily say anything overtly about culture. They just, people start and then they figure out what the culture is as they go along in the role. And we do it a little differently, where we really try to educate them to the culture as soon as they come in the door. Because it's one of the things that we value most. We know that they value it most. And we know it's one of the things that they're going to use to evaluate if this is a company that they want to stay with and work for or not. So we want to give them that information up front. So talking about that culture, and then also just making people feel supported in their first, several weeks on the job. It's difficult. I don't care if you're a freshman in high school or if you're starting 6th grade or if you're an adult entering the workforce. Being the new kid in the building is hard. When you don't know people and you don't have friends. And so making sure that they feel supported by the people around them and well trained. That was a hard lesson, I think, that we and a lot of other companies learned post-COVID. You could not get enough people to work in the buildings. And so you'd have people start and you would kind of almost throw them into the fire with not enough training and not enough time and not enough support because you really needed them. And it made for, I think, a really terrible introductory experience for a lot of people. And so we have learned better. And now, we've returned to our pre-COVID ways of making sure that, an onboarding is a slower ramp rather than this, fire drill sort of feeling.
Yeah, and it's so refreshing to hear that you do all these things so early on. Because what I hear, of course, not on the podcast, but kind of in the field talking to general managers and like restaurants, hotels, and gas stations, is they kind of allow their team members to struggle in week one and week two because they kind of want that naturally to weed people out and then invest into the people if they can survive the storm. And I'm looking at them like it's horrifying to me. But I feel like there's been so much scar tissue developed over the last couple of years of they're so overworked as managers. They've been burnt by so many people in kind of like the first 30 days that they don't even they're not trusting of their hourly workers in the very beginning to invest their own time because they've been training them and then they leave in the first 10 days so often. Right. And from my perspective, and my really humble opinion is like, yeah, it is a catch 22, but we as the employers have the responsibility to invest as early as possible. And if you do a good enough job, I think like the Moneyball theory will be in aggregate, more people will stay than dragging them through the fire in the first couple of weeks and then deciding to invest. And I feel like you agree with that, but I don't want to speak for you there.
Well, no, I absolutely agree with that for a couple of reasons. Number one, I tend to live my life by just the guiding principle of treat people how you would like to be treated. And I certainly wouldn't like to be brought into a company and welcomed and then put through the ringer for the first 2 weeks just so they could kind of test out my grit. And then I start getting support. That doesn't feel like the good way to establish a new relationship. And then secondarily, in this workforce economy, honestly, employers don't have the luxury of really putting employees through a hard time just to see if they'll stick around because there are too many open jobs. Not too many. There are so many. If people want to find somewhere to work, they can find somewhere to work. And so if you give them a really miserable 2 weeks, just to see if they'll make it, I think the odds are pretty good that they'll leave and find somewhere that maybe takes a different approach to onboarding. So yeah, no, I wouldn't.
Well,
I wouldn't subscribe to that.
In this space, one thing that I've loved with writing the book and doing this podcast is talking to so many people like you that are passionate about the space. I think amazing stewards of the hourly workforce and really drive the industry forward. But unfortunately, there's a lot of bad actors too, right? There's a lot of bad apples, and it's kind of the same people that say, "Oh, I'll hire anybody that can fog a mirror, or I'll take anybody with a pulse." Believe that. Right. And they bring our hourly workers through it, which is really, really unfortunate. And I don't want to give that too much airtime because I do have some other questions before I let you go. But this is super interesting, super fascinating. What is your stance? And have you guys thought a lot about encouraging or discouraging your current employees to get a second job and third job? Like, talk to us about the life of an Alamo worker and, have you seen anything along those lines be successful or unsuccessful?
Well, I will say that's an interesting question. I don't think that we really encourage or discourage our teammates to work one or multiple jobs. I think it really depends on what they need. I think where we sometimes run into issues is if our teammates are wanting to live a certain lifestyle and what we pay for the role that they have doesn't support it, then I think they tend to get upset about the amount that we're paying. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so it's kind of a difficult thing to talk through, and it can be very sensitive because I think people in general, not just the Alamo crowd, but I think employees in general, they want to work one job, full-time hours, and they want to feel like that would be enough to sustain them in their life goals, whether that's to, buy a house, maybe get married, maybe start a family, maybe make a film, maybe start a business, whatever it is. Yeah. And then I think the frustration comes in sometimes when the role that they're working doesn't pay enough to facilitate that. And so when I think the leaders are having conversations with those people, then sometimes the conversation comes in about, well, we can do flexible shifts and we can be flexible. So if you need to get a second job to support what you're doing, we can do that. Or if you want to continue to work to advance your career as you go up in the levels, the pay becomes this and then the pay becomes this. And so again, kind of charting them a career path within Alamo to higher pay is sometimes that helps resonate. But yeah, we're accustomed to our teammates, a lot of them being part-time. A lot of people work for a lot of people, not everyone by far, but for a lot of our teammates, the Alamo role is not their primary role. It's the part-time role. So they're a full-time, they're like a full-time, administrator at a school, or they're a full-time, nursing assistant, or they're a full-time whatever. And then they work at Alamo, on the weekends, on the side, on the evenings, because they either want to make extra money, or they want to get out of the house, or they want access to free movies, or, they have a lot of different motivations.
Talk to us, because it's such a unique workforce and a company that you can give real perks like that. Do you do special screenings for employees? Do you get X amount of tickets for the family? What does that look like for you?
Yeah. So often our teammates get access to see films first, because we have to do technical screenings to make sure that the content is going to play on the screens before we show it to the general public. So often when we do those technical screenings, they can be there and watch films early, which is a very big deal for them. They get access to a certain number of free movies every month, and then they get discounted tickets after that. Wow. They get a 50% discount on food and beverage when they attend as a guest. So if I go in with my family, or if one of our hourly teammates goes in with their family on their day off to watch a movie, they'll still get 50% off their food and beverage. When they're working, they get a free shift meal. So they get to eat for free during their shifts. Which is great. I've had a lot of our teammates tell me how much grocery money that saves them, just by virtue of the fact that they get to eat dinner while they're working. And that really, they appreciate that.
It's not just popcorn, I'm assuming.
No. See, that's also the benefit. If you can find a lot of these similar perks with different cinema chains, but if it's a traditional cinema, you're going to have the standard fare to choose from: popcorn, big pretzel, nachos. No, at Alamo, you can get fish and chips, you can get a burger and fries, you can get an Alamo bowl, we have food, you can have dinner.
Yeah, that's incredible.
So, and they like the fun perks like that too.
Love it. All right, so last question, because I know that we're over time, and I've asked every single guest this. It's question 1A, 1B. We have amazing, funny, hilarious stories, but we also have very serious stories, so feel free to answer however you'd like. 1A is, what was your first hourly job? And 1B is, were you fired or did you leave said job?
Well, this is easy. Okay, so my first hourly job, I told you, for this tiny town that I'm from, right? It's 100 people. So there is no grocery store, there is no gas station, there is no anything. You need to drive 20 minutes to get to the nearest anything. So in the town, 20 minutes away, there used to be a grocery store called Holton Country Mart, and they had a customer service counter that rented videos, like VHS tapes, when I was in high school. That was my first job, and it came with tremendous inherent power, because in a small town on the weekends, there is not much else to do other than rent and watch movies. So while holding my position of power at the customer service counter and video rental, I would get calls and say, "Heather, did you get a copy of Titanic in? I promised my girlfriend that we could watch it tonight, and I've been calling all day and they don't have one." And I would say, "I don't have one yet." And they would say, "If you get one in, will you please save it for me? I will do anything, whatever it takes. Just I promised her," right? So you have to decide, who you're going to benefit and who you're not going to benefit. So it came along with tremendous power, and I wielded it well. So yes, Holton Country Mart customer service and video rental was my first job. My dad used to prank call me, because you also sold lottery tickets up there, and you sold tobacco and such. So my dad would call and he would say, "Do you have Prince Albert in a can?" And I would say, "Yes, we do." And he would say, "Oh, you better let him out." And then he'd crack up, which was a total dad joke. And no, I was not fired. I have never been fired. I'm kind of I'm going to speak without my boss on the call, which is great, but no, I'm kind of the employee that everybody wants to have. I just, I can get along with most people. I work really hard. I care about what I'm doing. My performance and the performance of the company that I work for is always of the utmost importance to me. And so if I ever did get fired, it might be soul crushing for me. It would be a pivotal moment.
I hear you. And I love the story about the video store. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York called Skinny Atlas. And there was a video store that was attached to the bowling alley. And I can't even think of what the name of it was. I'll have to ask my wife. We're high school sweethearts. But I remember there was a wall of shame because it was kind of before people used credit cards at scale. So if you
Okay.
took a movie, they wouldn't they would charge you for like the week rental. But if you stole the movie, then your your picture got put up on the wall and you weren't allowed to rent it from there. And there was always like, the kids that were a bit of the pranksters that they would have like almost a hall of fame of like, oh, they took out Super Smash Brothers on N64, or they took out a PG-13 movie and they were actually 11 years old, or hey, they moved out of town and they kept all the movies that they had. So I definitely have some nostalgia. So it's funny to think through. But again, Heather, thank you so much for bringing your insights. I'm always inspired after we talk, and it seems like you're doing amazing things personally as well as at Alamo. And we're really grateful to have you here. If somebody from the podcast wants to get in touch with you, wants to learn more about your work, wants to learn more about Alamo, where could they find that?
They can search for Heather Morgan on LinkedIn, or they can just email me at heather.morgan@drafthouse.com.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you so much, Heather. We'll chat.
Thanks, AJ.
All right, bye.